Welcome to Small Groups for 2016-2017 here at Legacy. Our first series is going to be based on the theme Look Outward. The idea being that we look out if we are having a difficulty or a problem, but we want to go beyond that and look outward to the world around us. As a part of this series, we're going to have 8 different lessons that are going to focus on how to be able to look outward. This first session will be to look outward with joy. The key points we're going to have in this series are taken from the subheadings of the book I Will by Tom Rainier. We're going to try to include some illustrations that are legacy specific. We're going to try to make sure we have related scriptures for each concept and have legacy specific discussion questions for your small group. This first lesson is going to focus on our attitude about church. If we develop and have the right attitude, doing becomes natural and joyous. If we have the wrong attitude, we submit to legalistic guidelines and get frustrated or burned out. We want to remind ourselves that no church is perfect, and Legacy is far from perfect. We have many areas in which we need to grow, but we serve and do anyway because of the purpose we have in serving God. The first right attitude we want to look at is to be a unifying church member. Each individual must decide to put the group good before his or her own needs. And as a part of that, we ask you to please pause to read Ephesians 4, 1 through 3 out loud. In this passage, we see humility, gentleness, patience, and acceptance of one another in love as important values. We're to extend grace just as Jesus extends it to us. So for group discussion, how are each of us doing as unifying church members? Please give examples where we see this happening. Right attitude number 2 is being a sacrificial church member. We're going to ask you at this time to pause the presentation and read Philippians 2, 5 through 8 out loud. Sacrifice is the attitude of Christ. When we sacrifice, we are acting most like Christ. And so for group discussion, how are each of us doing as sacrificing church members? And we want to give examples where we see this happening. Our third right attitude is to be a prayerful church member. We're going to ask you to pause at this time and read Colossians 1, 9 through 10 out loud. Paul had an attitude of prayerfulness. Prayer is a part of putting on the armor of God. It's a part of our spiritual arsenal and protection. So with that, for discussion, how are we doing as prayerful church members? Please give any examples that you've seen here at Legacy. Right attitude number 4 is to be a joyful church member. We're going to ask you to pause the recording and read Philippians 4, 4 through 7 out loud. We are to be gentle, gracious, and grateful, which Tom Rainier calls being a joyous church member. On the other hand, we are not to be harsh, hardened, and hateful, which his description would be a grumpy church member. So for our discussion today, would people over time be more likely to see us as joyful church members or as grumpy church members? So some next steps on being able to look out with joy. We are to move from right attitudes to right actions. A great attitude about church leads to great actions by the church, which of course is us. This helps each of us move from looking out for self to looking outward for others. In other words, it's not all about me. And I think that's an important part of us being able to look outward with joy. So hopefully as we go through this series, You're going to see some ways to look outward, improve our attitudes, and help us to be outwardly focused Christians. Welcome to the second lesson in our series, Look Outward. This lesson is going to focus on our ability to look outward in worship. I want to reflect for a minute on what some people will do, including us. Several years ago, I was asked to go to San Angelo, Texas, and speak at a lectureship. And in that, I was asked on a Saturday morning at 7:15 in the morning to drive from this person's house to the church building. When I drove by the lake there, I noticed there was a soccer field out there, several soccer fields, in fact, and probably thousands of people with their children out there at 7:15 in the morning playing soccer. I kind of observed that many of them would likely say it's too early to be up at 7:15 on a Sunday, or it's inconvenient to go to church in the morning. In other words, we will do what we believe to be important. We want to reflect for a minute on our worship with others. Yes, we have our individual response to God, and that's worship. That worship we do 24/7. God also tells us that we're supposed to have an experience of worship with others. We sometimes call that corporate worship. I want to ask you to take a moment and pause the recording and read Acts 2:46 through 47 out loud. We want to notice that the early followers of Jesus devoted themselves to being together. They were joyful and had humble attitudes in their interaction with each other. All of this led to having favor with all the people. As we think about looking outward in worship, we have to think about an important attitude. We go to corporate worship to worship the one true God as we serve with other believers. And because of that, worship is not about us. So where are you and I on most Sundays? Are we at home? Are we at work? Are we out of town? And so for discussion, share some of your experiences as you've gone to church when you've been out of town, either positive ones or negative ones. True worshipers. We want to ask you to pause the recording and read John 4:23 through 24 out loud. Notice that worshipers in spirit and truth are the worshipers that God is seeking. And the good news is we're able to become those kind of worshipers. So for discussion, share together how where we spend our time says much about what's important or worshiped by us. You've heard it talked about a lot, and I have through the years, about how our worship has become preference driven. We are to be careful not to move from self-sacrificing to self-serving attitudes in worship. We see this in a lot of ways. We want our preference in music styles. We want our preference in preaching styles. We want our preferences so worship feels comfortable to us. Yet we want to think more about having a joy-driven worship. We're to move from worship as a task or duty to worship as a joy. We will want to say, I want to participate. I will pray before I go. I will pray as I arrive. I will pray to be a worshiper and not a judge. So as we look at next steps in looking outward in worship, we're to move from worship that looks inward to worship that looks outward. Worship that is a worship of God that includes other people. And so for discussion, consider real ways that we can move toward a joy-driven attitude of worship that looks outward and not inward. Because in this series, we want to look and become outwardly focused Christians. And our time of worship, and corporate worship especially, is a time in which people will experience many of the things that are part of church life. So we hope and pray that as you think about these ideas in your small group and discuss them, that you can learn ways to be able to look outward and to be an outwardly focused Christian. Welcome to our third lesson in the series, Look Outward. This third lesson is going to focus on looking outward to serve. We want to ask the question, what about being a vibrant and serving church? At this point, I want to tell a story of a church visit by a ministry colleague of mine. He was traveling out in, I believe it was Nevada or California, and he just saw this group of people on a Sunday where he had chosen to worship, and he had seen that they were really involved in a lot of projects, and there was just a lot of joy in the room. And he just really felt comfortable and felt like he was really surrounded by positive people in a positive congregation. And he began to look around and notice there were 46 people in the room. Vibrance and serving are not all about numbers, because we can share the story of Heather and her former church that was in Tom Rainer's book, I Will. Heather was a part of a much larger church that seemed to have some activities and things going around, but for Heather, the church seemed rather program focused. It didn't seem very connected. And so for her, when she eventually chose to go to a different church, she felt that she was able to get involved and serve more because that church seemed to get her more engaged. In thinking about serving as Jesus served, we want to ask you to please pause the recording and read Matthew 20, 21 through 28 out loud. We want to note that the greatest follower of Jesus will be as a culture's lowest servant. And in that culture of the first century, washing feet was the lowest position for a servant. Jesus was about serving, not being served. So for group discussion, we want to ask you to say churches are becoming more and more consumer-minded, both in approach and in expectation by members. And so we want to have you discuss, how did this mindset develop? A key attitude in this is one that Tom Rainer challenges us to look at. He says we are to stop complaining, stop demanding, and stop trying to get our way. Instead, put others first. And this is part of our sub-theme that serving is not about us. So as we think about our life, where is our focus? Please pause the recording at this time and read Philippians 2, 3 through 4 out loud. We are to serve the interests of others and not just our own. This is a basis for humility that expresses itself in service. So for group discussion, how can we balance handling our own legitimate needs with looking outward to help others with legitimate needs? Serving God as a small group. One of the things that our small groups churches have been doing for many years is seeking ways to be able to serve. And this time we have several areas of suggested service for our small groups. We want to ask you to help find and or fund a Share the Blessings project. Share the Blessings specifically looks at people outside of our church who are in desperate need financially and otherwise, where we step in with a project to radically help them. Maybe a serving project is to adopt a senior adult and to spend some time with that person and be able to meet their needs. Perhaps it's involvement in the Spark Ministry for some of our teenage moms that are having to deal with the struggles of having a child. Maybe we participate in one of our community service projects as a small group. We work together on something out there, out in the community. A listing of these will be placed in Church Community Builder in the co-leader group so that your co-leader can reference these things. So we want to ask you to take a minute right now and talk about what your group would like to do at some point in this small group cycle for one or more serving opportunities together. A preference-driven model of serving reminds us we have to move from a self-serving attitude for serving to an outwardly serving attitude for serving. I know that's kind of difficult to wrap our brains around, but some people serve truly to only get something for themselves. So for discussion, as we try to be an example of outward serving while others seem perhaps more self-serving, how do we keep the best attitude and not become prideful? So for our next steps, to move from self-service to outward service, let us consider first being less critical or judgmental of what's going on at church. The second thing is to begin praying for a deeper servant attitude. The third would be to be praying for others that might be struggling with self-service. And then lastly, committing to positive service of at least 1 hour a week that looks outward. Serving people outside of the church is extremely important because in many ways, this is the first contact people have with Christianity. It shows that we're not just about words, or we're not just about talk, but that we truly take our faith and put it in action. And we hope that as we look outward during this cycle and beyond, that we're moved to be able to serve the people that are around us. Well, welcome to our fourth lesson in the series, Look Outward. This fourth lesson is going to focus on looking outward and actually going. The story of many churches of Christ. We've seen a once vibrant and growing church going to its peak, then slowly tapering off. Eventually, the group can get so small that it's pretty much dead. Sometimes these churches have less graciously been called hospice churches. They are terminal and have a short time to live. I want to ask you the question, which kind of church are we? We're often asked what kind of church, but a play off of that is which kind of church are we? Are we a church in decline? A slow, steady tapering off of people and energy? Are we a church of recline? Are we content to be comfortable and sit back while others make things happen? Or are we a church of incline? Are we moving forward with energy and selfless service in a way that is bringing growth to the group? So for group discussion, how can being a look outward church bring focus to what kind of climb we are on? I want to focus for a minute on a church ready for decline. This kind of a church grows and declines as does the community around it. In other words, if the church builds in a growing area, it will grow very quickly. But perhaps as the community around it starts folding up a little bit more, as houses are sold and maybe even people abandon the little community, the church starts declining. In other words, there's no intentionality to look outward. And that intentionality never develops in the DNA of the church, as Tom Rainier will put it. Without this piece of DNA in it, members focus primarily inwardly, and thus on their own comfort level and their own needs. Eventually, the life-giving benefit of new people is not present, and the group simply sucks the life out of itself. And then, of course, the blame starts to flow. We want to look at some attitudes that hurt a go mindset. We take this directly from Tom Rainier's book. Some people will say, evangelism is not my gift. Well, what's interesting is looking at Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12, evangelism is never listed as a gift. All of us have some responsibility to share the good news of Jesus. We have staff to do that. And yes, staff is important and your staff works hard here at Legacy. But a go mindset is something every one of us have. Because even if every staff member is going, it's not going to be as powerful as literally hundreds, yea, thousands of people have a look outward mindset. We say, I don't have the time. Well, as we said in a couple of lessons ago, we will make time for what's important for us. And if going is important, we will make the time to do it. Some will say, I don't want to impose my belief on others. And hopefully our approach to sharing Christ isn't imposing anything. But there's a big difference between sharing our beliefs and forcing our beliefs on people. And the last is some people will say, well, I'm just an introvert. I'm a private person. Well, there are many ways, even as an introvert, to be able to share the things of God and have a look outward mindset that doesn't necessarily have to involve being in direct interaction with people. So where is our focus? Please pause the recording at this time and read Acts 1 verse 8 out loud. The first place they were to go was right there in Jerusalem. Right there where they were. And from that we can better look way outward as we learn to look outward here. And so for group discussion, how can we balance looking outward locally with looking outward at other places or even countries? And let's consider how one feeds the other. So the need to go and share hope. Tom Rainier really challenges us to consider, do we really believe that those who are not Christians need saving? And we want to ask, do you believe that those without Christ are lost? Take a minute, please, and pause and read Luke 19:10 and John 14:1 through 6 out loud. So as a group, please take a minute to talk about how this concept of lostness can provide the urgency for us to go. So some next steps. To move from decline past recline to incline, let's consider, first of all, praying to see local opportunities right here in the mid-cities. Yes, even inviting people to church so that it becomes part of our DNA. Going beyond praying and looking outward intentionally. In other words, looking for those real opportunities to interact and deal with people as we come in contact with each day. And then being as ready to share the story of Jesus as we can be. We often in our churches reference the Great Commission and say that we are to go and make disciples of all nations. Being a looking outward Christian means we're always looking to go. It may not be halfway around the world, it may be right here in the mid-cities, but yet our need to look out and go is no less important. It helps us to be outwardly focused Christians. Well, welcome to the beginning of the second half of our series, Look Outward. We're now in Lesson 5, which is going to talk about looking outward and giving. So I want to tell the story of a true giver. We have a friend in our family who was named Polly. Polly was an older Christian at one of our former congregations who was widowed and her son had passed away. She decided to be so positively outward giving that she would give encouragement and hugs and smiles and, yes, even money to people that would be around her. Yes, she took care of herself, but at the same time she was very, very giving. She was so good to my own family that hopefully you've had a Polly in your life, because after Polly passed away, all 4 of my daughters made the effort to go to the funeral, and the one that could not go to the funeral made a special effort to go to Polly's graveside. Maybe you are that Polly for someone else or people around you. So I'm going to ask, where is our treasure? Please pause and read Matthew 6:19 through 21. The key is where the heart is, even more than how much stuff we have. For discussion, we want to say, how does collecting heavenly treasure help us to be people that look outward? We want to talk some about making giving real. To do that, we all have some listing of transactions or the way that we spend money. Perhaps it's a debit card statement or a credit card statement. But we all have a way of listing our transactions somehow, because how we spend our money says a lot about where our heart is. And every once in a while we need to review that listing of transactions to see where our heart is. It reminds me of the old story of the $20 bill talking with the $1 bill. The $20 bill said, well, I've had a great time. I've gone to the movies, I've gone to the restaurants, I've gone to the theater shows, I've gone on vacation, just really happy. But the $1 bill looked down sadly and said, well, all I ever do is get to go to church. Tom Rainier challenges us, if we are not cheerfully generous with the funds God has entrusted to us, we are not an obedient follower of Christ. And from that perspective, he's talking about making giving real, making giving generous, and making Christ important. Rainier also asks, when did talking about giving become so taboo? On some level, it's always been difficult to talk about giving to God, but more recent challenges have made it even more difficult. Some see the extravagant lifestyles of a handful of ministers. Some want to cite not offending visitors, so they won't talk about giving. Some are so blatant to say they don't even want to offend members by talking about giving. And so as part of your group discussion, I want to ask you, should we be talking about giving in the church? And if so, what should the talk be about? Now I want to talk about the power of giving, or is giving power? In other words, some of the negative side of the way giving can be handled in church. There are church members who withhold from their church giving when they don't like what's going on. That may be difficult for you to believe, but I have seen cases of that at churches at which I've worked. It's called the pocketbook veto. We will stop giving so that we can effect change in the church. Some even go so far as to say that their giving entitles them to receive special treatment or special services from the church. In other words, is it the power of giving, or is it giving power? We need to give generously. We want to ask you to pause and read 2 Corinthians 9, 6 through 7, and then chapter 8, 1 through 5. Motivations behind our giving are deeply important. And what's interesting is that word joyfully here means hilariously. Really, really happy. And so in our discussion, if tithing or giving 10% is a minimum giving guide from the Old Covenant, discuss how we should be giving hilariously beyond that amount in the New and Better Covenant. So some next steps as we think about looking outward and giving. To move from a hoarder mindset to a giver mindset, let's consider praying to soften our hearts toward hilarious giving. That God is the holder of the real treasure, far beyond money. That we need to consider planning carefully. That's the real meaning of laying by in store. And then giving to church even beyond our comfort zone, knowing that we will never give to a perfect group of people. Looking outward and giving is very important, and we hope that this session helps us to think beyond ourselves and help us to look outward. Welcome to Lesson 6 in our series, Look Outward. Lesson 6 is going to focus on our need to look outward and not drop out. I want to tell the story of one person unattached. This person's parents didn't always agree about church. When they finally did select a church, it was in a different school area. This person knew no one. So this led to sporadic attendance, which led to sporadic attachment. And by the college years, this person had drifted pretty much away from church. As you've probably already figured out, I am that person. I never got attached as a young person, and because of that, I wasn't a lookout, I was a dropout. Who keeps us on the lookout team? Our focus in this series has been on looking outward, and that's important. But being on the lookout team has its challenges. We find out very quickly not everyone likes us. We need positive influences to keep us looking out in a healthy way. So I want to ask you to pause and read 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. For group discussion, how do you think a church family should be supporting each other? Have you had experiences here or elsewhere where you did not feel connected to others? Making church connections real. Some people have never had a connection to a church. I was one of those people. Some people's connection was only their parents or family or a friend. When they left, they left. Some are so excited about church at first that they go from 0 to 60 in church involvement right away. The connections are real, but they are not long term. So I want to look at why lookouts drop out. In the 1980s, John Savage identified several sources leading to dropout. Any of these can lead to a crisis. The first area is conflict inside of ourselves that leads to anxiety. This could be from something in reality. Difficult events as in a divorce, job loss, or bereavement. This kind of falls in John 16:33 where it talks about in this world you will have tribulation. Maybe that conflict inside of ourselves is one about our morality. Maybe there's been a breach or a lapse of good morality or the committing of a sin. Maybe our conflict inside is just neurotic. It's from our own imagination. For example, someone didn't say hello, so they must not like me. Or that conflict inside of ourselves is truly existential, where we walk around with unanswered questions about the meaning of life. The next category of why lookouts drop out is conflict outside of ourselves that leads to anxiety. Perhaps it's conflict with a family member, maybe arguing or separation. It could be conflict with a church leader, a minister, or an elder. It could be conflict with other families or people in church. Or it could be a conflict with the church about too many expectations, or in other words, burnout. I've done all the looking out that I can do, and I'm just flat tired of the expectations. So for group discussion, as you look at the factors inside of us and outside of us that can lead to dropping out of church, have you had experiences with any of these that caused you to drop out for a while? Or maybe was the dropout one where you still went to church but didn't want to do anything for God or others? At this point, we want to talk about how to be a healthy lookout. Please pause and read Ephesians 2, 8 through 9. We're reminded there that we don't have to earn our keep. We have been saved by grace through faith. It's not something that we can earn. But yet Ephesians 2:10 reminds us that there are God-prepared works for us to walk in. And so we don't have to say yes to every serving opportunity that comes around. We need to be a God pleaser and not a people pleaser. So for group discussion, how can we help each other find our place as lookouts in the church in a way that keeps us spiritually healthy? So some next steps for us to consider. To be a lookout and not a dropout, let's keep using but not abusing our spiritual muscles. Let's make sure we stay active and building up the body of Christ, as in Ephesians 4:15 through 16. We need to not wait to serve until we're invited to. Get in there and start serving and being a part and connecting. And remember that our service is not useless in God's eyes. Galatians 6:9 through 10 reminds us that if we continue to sow, we will reap good things and that God will not forget our good service. So yes, we want to be lookouts. We want to look out into our community, into people around us, the needs other than our own, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't cause us to drop out. We need to put positive influences around us that help us and sustain us and make us want to stay connected well within this community of faith. Welcome to Lesson 7 in the Look Outward series. Lesson 7 is going to focus on Look Outward with Grace. This in many ways is an extension of the end of Lesson 6, where we talked about how we are saved by grace through faith. Avoiding churchianity. Churchianity is defined as practicing our church and religious beliefs according to human standards rather than biblical guidelines. Tom Rainer's definition. And in this lesson, we want to take a real look at what church membership is all about. What is church membership? Please pause and read 1 Corinthians 12, 27 through 28. Church is people. People connected by God into a local and universal body of believers. We are to function together. We are to sacrifice together. We are to practice vibrant Christianity. The functioning church. This is about doing, not being spectators watching others. People who are doers make decisions. People who are spectators question decisions. And so for group discussion, consider how church members are to function together. How are we doing with this here at Legacy? And who is responsible for this? I want to come back a little bit to the idea we had a couple of lessons ago about what we get for our dues. Our financial contribution does not entitle us in our church membership like a country club or fitness club membership. We want to ask you to pause and read Mark 10, verse 45. So for group discussion, what are some ways people get into a what's in it for me mindset about church? Without sharing names, have you heard comments at Legacy that sound more like demands from dues-paying members than it does from people who are part of a church? Handling our flaws with grace. We often ignore our own flaws or focus only on the flaws of others. And admittedly, there are plenty of flaws to find among church members, including ourselves. We're to be careful not to let our attitudes lead to cliquishness. And what I mean by cliquishness is the idea of people who seem to be similar in outlook and perspective, excluding people whose flaws don't seem to fit in with them. Please pause and read Philippians 2, 14 through 16. So for group discussion, when we find ourselves being a complainer, what is that saying about our relationship with others in church? Member expectations. Solid churches have expectations of its members. There are expectations for attendance, giving, serving, sharing, fellowship. Our challenge is to have expectations that reflect Christianity rather than churchianity. This is part of what we try to address in our new members class. We want people to experience Christ at this church. And we don't want them to experience a bunch of tradition or what Rainier calls churchianity. So for group discussion, what would be some spiritually healthy expectations for each other as church members? The next steps. As a church that wants to look outward with grace, we remove needless barriers to being a member. We remove barriers that separate believers into cliques. We are open to new ways of doing things. Here we need to remember that many of the things we do are simply traditional. We don't always have to get our way, and we choose to serve and be happy in the body of Christ. Church membership is important. We need each other. We need connection. And as we look outward, may we do that as outwardly focused Christians connected well to one another. Welcome to the final lesson in our series, Look Outward. We hope that the prior 7 lessons have sharpened your focus on the need to look outward and to do with some of the proper attitudes and things that are involved. We want to spend this final lesson sharpening up our purpose. How can we make sure that we look outward with purpose? As a church and as individuals, we want to be about making a difference. So I want to encourage you to please pause and then read 1 John 3:16 through 18. Yes, words and reflection have importance, yet it is our actions that ultimately change things. And so for discussion, have there been times in your life when you have talked things up but did not get anything done? Is that admission a difficult one for you, and why? And yes, it's painful as I dictate that narration. I've talked some things up and then not done anything in action. Getting us to look outward. Please pause and read Mark 1:1 through 8. Think of the small start to John the Baptist's ministry. John started with a handful, then it spread to the whole countryside, because looking outward can be contagious. We're involved in a greater movement than John's. Please pause and read Mark 1:14 through 18. Jesus began with a small number and a clear message. And so for our discussion, how does being a disciple of Jesus lead to being a look outward Christian? Our challenge: God often uses one obedient nobody to get his people to look outward. Tom Rainier labels this as an I will attitude. So as part of this, please pause and read Isaiah 6 through 13. So as a group, what are some ways each of us here at Legacy can be, here am I, send me, lookouts for him? And then what are the implications if we are not those people? So our next steps as we think about looking outward with purpose. As a church that wants to look outward with purpose, we go beyond words and start doing together. We resolve to be doers and not just spectators. We prayerfully want to make a positive difference. And hopefully, ultimately, we will.